They say there are places in America that do not appear on ordinary maps, places that the country pretends do not exist. Milbrook, tucked deep into the forgotten woods of Pennsylvania, is one of those places a town whispered about, rumored, partially erased, and deliberately ignored. Roads do not lead there anymore. The trees seem to close in as if nature itself is trying to bury the memory of it. Yet the people who were born inside its boundaries never left, because leaving was never something they were allowed to imagine. What lived there was not simply a community, but a carefully raised lineage, a family tree twisted so tightly around itself that it could no longer tell where branches ended and where roots began. Those who once oversaw Milbrook believed they were shaping the future. They claimed it was control, discipline, preservation, the study of what happens when isolation becomes destiny. What actually formed instead was something darker, something not entirely human in spirit anymore. Generations passed without the world noticing, until the world chose not to notice at all. The houses rotted, but the people stayed. The faces changed, but the blood never did. It was as if time had sealed them in a glass jar, left them to decay in silence while the rest of civilization kept moving forward. But silence has a way of holding secrets until they rot through their container, and Milbrook's secrets had begun to seep out. The first sign wasn't a scream, or a body, or a headline. It was a journal, an aging leather book filled with clinical handwriting and sketches of things that could not be explained away as rumor. It found its way into the wrong hands, or perhaps the right ones, depending on who you asked. And with it came the first glimpse into what Milbrook had become, and what it was still capable of doing to anyone foolish enough to step inside. Because Milbrook doesn't just live in the past. It survives in the present, breathing, watching, waiting, and it does not welcome strangers. Milbrook did not begin as a town so much as a controlled enclosure, a place deliberately carved out of Pennsylvania's forgotten woodland with the intention of seeing what would grow if the rest of the world was shut out and a single bloodline was allowed to wind endlessly inward upon itself. The origins were never officially acknowledged, yet scattered testimonies spoke of silent funding, unmarked trucks, and planners who talked about humanity in laboratory terms. Those who founded Milbrook did not speak of love, community, or future. They spoke of variables, outcomes, and how isolation could sculpt human nature when no foreign influence could slip through. Families were selected, relocated, and locked into a closed-loop life where roads that led in eventually stopped leading out. A perimeter of silence surrounded the settlement, reinforced by fear, myth, and the steady erasure of Milbrook from public knowledge. Records vanished, maps were revised, and even nearby towns pretended there was only empty forest where living houses actually breathed. Within Milbrook, children grew under rules they could not question because those rules existed long before they did, under elders who called themselves guardians of purity, convinced they were maintaining something sacred rather than manufacturing quiet ruin. Generations formed around that belief like sediment, each layer thicker, stranger, and more obedient than the last. Outsiders were discussed like ghosts, dangerous illusions meant to lure people away from destiny. The experiment thrived on secrecy, and secrecy became a culture, then a religion. While the outside world advanced, forgot, and replaced memories with new fears, Milbrook settled deeper into itself, sealed like a jar kept at the back of a dark shelf. Only those who remembered the beginning understood that the people inside were never meant to flourish in the way normal towns do. They were meant to be studied, supervised, shaped by unseen hands. Over time those hands withdrew, funding withered, watchers disappeared, but Milbrook had already learned to watch itself, to police its borders with inherited loyalty and internal terror. By then it no longer mattered who had started the experiment, because the experiment had learned to sustain itself, feeding on bloodlines, tradition, and the quiet conviction that nothing beyond those woods was ever meant for them, nothing beyond that name ever truly existed, and whatever they had become was no accident but the result of a design that lingered even when its creators had long since stopped looking. From the beginning, Milbrook was never meant to welcome strangers, because the philosophy at its core depended entirely on shutting the world out and convincing those inside that anything beyond their borders was corrupt, diseased, or spiritually dangerous. The elders spoke often of purity, not in the sense of cleanliness or morality, but as something biological and sacred, something that could only be preserved if no new blood ever entered and no existing blood ever escaped. Their words passed through generations like commandments carved into bone, repeated until they didn't just become belief but identity. Outsiders became an idea rather than real people, reduced to warnings told to children at night, stories of sickness and madness waiting beyond the tree line. Marriage was no longer a personal choice but a prescribed duty, arranged and enforced by those who claimed to know destiny better than the individuals living it. Every generation was matched like pieces in a carefully assembled puzzle, not for love or compatibility, but for lineage and controlled inheritance of traits. It was said the town was chosen, blessed, selected by forces greater than government or religion, and that allowing foreign blood to mix with theirs would shatter something fragile and holy. Those who questioned were silenced gently at first, then harshly when needed, until questioning itself disappeared as a habit. Meanwhile, the outside world became the enemy in their minds, a distant storm of chaos and decay, while Milbrook was painted as the last stronghold of order and righteousness. This belief allowed cruelty to disguise itself as protection, isolation to masquerade as devotion, and generational confinement to feel like purpose. What began as policy hardened into culture, and culture hardened into an unbreakable rule that shaped every birth, every marriage, every whispered fear. Outsiders who accidentally drew too close to Milbrook seldom stayed long, pushed away by cold stares or subtle threats, and in the rare moments when someone tried to remain, the town closed in with a quiet hostility that made leaving feel like survival. Over the decades, the refusal to let new blood in stopped feeling like control and started feeling like fate, something no one alive remembered agreeing to but everyone understood they were bound to honor, even as the consequences began to quietly bloom inside their bodies, their minds, and their children. With each passing generation in Milbrook, the consequences of isolation began to grow visible in ways that could no longer be ignored, yet the elders forced everyone to pretend it was simply destiny shaping them into something chosen. Children were born with frailties that medicine could not explain away, with eyes that seemed too distant or minds that struggled to understand simple things, and occasionally with deformities whispered about behind closed doors, hidden from outsiders who were never supposed to know the town existed anyway. What frightened people even more than the physical changes were the shifts in behavior, the way tempers flared quicker, the way fear sank deeper, the way entire families began to display the same peculiarities of mind, repeating patterns of obsession, paranoia, and violence as if they were inherited traits. The elders cloaked this unraveling in ritual, inventing ceremonies meant to justify suffering, calling them tests of loyalty or acts of faith, until cruelty became woven into tradition. Strange customs developed, things done in the dead of night, offerings made to silence, punishments carried out with hollow eyes and trembling hands because no one wanted to be the one accused of disobedience. Laughter grew rarer, replaced by a heavy quiet that clung to every room and every meal, as if the very air carried the weight of secrets too dark to speak aloud. Children grew up watching their parents break a little more each year, while being taught that everything happening to them was proof of their importance rather than evidence of decay. Whispers spread of people who wandered into the woods and never came back, of those whose minds slipped so far into terror and confusion that they could no longer tell reality from the stories drilled into them since birth, yet their disappearances were explained away as necessary sacrifices or divine consequences. The town doctor, once hopeful and trusted, began to move through Milbrook like a haunted figure, collecting symptoms like silent confessions, unable to cure what had been designed into the community from the very beginning. Houses filled with echoes of prayers that sounded more like apologies, and faces aged faster beneath the pressure of pretending everything was normal. By then, the experiment's shadow was no longer something approaching in the distance, it lived inside their veins, shaped their thoughts, controlled their choices, and no one could remember a time when things had been different because the past had been rewritten until it sounded like glory instead of warning. The town physician was once the closest thing Milbrook had to a voice of reason, a man who arrived believing his job was to heal but slowly realized he was instead witnessing a quiet unraveling that no medicine could mend, so he began to document everything in secret, filling notebooks with observations he could never speak aloud. At first his writing was clinical, detached, the way doctors are trained to be, but over the years his notes shifted into something almost confessional as he tracked the mounting deformities, the shared psychological fractures, the uncanny repetition of illness that seemed less like coincidence and more like a curse passed deliberately from parent to child. He recorded strange nightly gatherings the elders required, rituals cloaked in tradition that masked fear with devotion, and he wrote of punishments disguised as discipline that left marks not just on skin but on minds. He watched children grow into haunted adults and adults age into wary shadows of themselves, and every time he tried to intervene he found himself pushed aside by the council that ruled over the town's destiny. Their word was law, their belief unquestionable, and whenever he asked too many questions he was reminded that he was only there to observe, not interfere. So he observed, silently breaking, stitching lies for his public reports while telling the truth only to paper. He began to suspect that Milbrook was not merely neglected by those who started it, but deliberately maintained through abandonment, allowed to decay because that decay was part of the design, and the more he wrote the more he feared what might happen if anyone outside ever truly understood what had been created there. His journals became a map of deterioration, page after page of human life twisting under invisible pressure, his handwriting growing shakier as he struggled under the burden of knowing too much and being able to change nothing. He hid his records in places only he could reach, terrified of what the council might do if they discovered how deeply he had seen through their carefully built illusions. Over time he stopped believing he was a doctor at all and began to feel more like a witness trapped in a long, slow disaster, surrounded by people who had accepted suffering as destiny while he alone understood it as the result of an experiment that was still quietly happening around them, still reshaping every breath they took, every life born, every fading hope that anything beyond Milbrook would ever matter again. Decades after the physician's journals were hidden away, they resurfaced in the hands of a young journalist, a person driven by curiosity and a stubborn belief that some truths demanded to be uncovered, no matter how unpleasant. The leather-bound book arrived anonymously, its edges worn, the ink faded but legible, and the pages filled with observations that blurred the line between science, horror, and human tragedy. From the very first lines, the journalist understood that what lay before them was no ordinary story. It was an account of lives meticulously controlled, of a town that had been shaped into something unnatural and almost unrecognizable to the outside world. Names were carefully recorded, events documented with obsessive detail, and patterns began to emerge, patterns of missing persons, strange illnesses, sudden disappearances, and behaviors that hinted at rituals the journalist could barely imagine. As they read, the journalist realized the journal was more than a historical record, it was a warning. Every line carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and had been powerless to stop it. The more pages they turned, the more they began to understand the depths of Milbrook's isolation and the scale of what had been done there over generations. It was a town where obedience was enforced not only through fear but through the shaping of the body and mind itself, where the very bloodline had been manipulated to achieve outcomes that outsiders would find monstrous. The journalist felt both dread and fascination, the kind that grips the chest and makes the air feel thick, as if the story itself were alive and aware of being read. With each revelation, the journalist became increasingly aware that uncovering Milbrook's secrets would not be as simple as reporting what had already happened. The town was still functioning, still existing, and still watching. The journal included notes on surveillance, on neighbors reporting each other, and on methods of silencing dissent, suggesting that Milbrook had long been a self-sustaining experiment, thriving on secrecy and inherited obedience. The journalist's mind raced with the implications, realizing that every story they had ever covered about strange disappearances or unexplainable events in the region could now be connected to this hidden network of control. It became clear that reading the journal was only the beginning. To understand the full picture, they would have to step inside the shadows it described, into a town where the past and present collided in ways that the outside world had never seen and perhaps never should. The journalist could feel the pull, the inexorable lure of truth and danger entwined, and with it the growing sense that the moment they crossed the invisible boundary, nothing would remain the same. As the journalist began to trace the locations described in the physician's journal, they quickly realized that Milbrook existed in a place that the outside world had systematically erased. Maps offered no guidance. Where forests should have opened onto valleys, the terrain seemed to fold in on itself, and public records made no mention of settlements or families in the area. Even the oldest locals in neighboring towns insisted that Milbrook was a myth, a story told to frighten children or occupy idle imaginations. But the journal was precise, referencing landmarks, ridges, and old roads that had vanished or been deliberately obscured over time. It became apparent that Milbrook had not only been isolated physically but had been erased from collective memory, scrubbed from official archives, and sealed off in ways designed to prevent discovery. The journalist began to understand that the town's disappearance was no accident or oversight. It was a calculated effort to remove any trace of the community, ensuring that generations of inbreeding, ritualized cruelty, and secret governance could proceed without interference. Attempts to reconcile the journal's descriptions with maps, land surveys, or census data yielded contradictions and anomalies, as if the region itself had been edited, redrawn, or reimagined. Roads led nowhere, streams appeared and disappeared, and old landmarks referenced in the journal could not be located, giving the landscape an almost surreal quality, as if it existed in a parallel logic that obeyed different rules than the outside world. The journalist also discovered hints that government records had been manipulated, perhaps to disguise funding, oversight, or the initial purpose of Milbrook's creation, leaving only fragmented testimonies and cryptic photographs to guide their search. The more they investigated, the more it became clear that the town's erasure was a form of protection not for the outsiders, but for the town itself, shielding its dark experiments from scrutiny while giving it freedom to evolve along the lines dictated by the original planners. The absence of Milbrook from maps and records became a presence in itself, a warning that the world beyond its borders had been intentionally kept blind, and that anyone attempting to penetrate that blind spot risked walking into something that had been carefully hidden for decades. The landscape of the forgotten woods seemed alive with secrets, its gaps and voids like the spaces between the lines of a text only partially revealed, daring the journalist to decipher them, to prove that Milbrook was not just a story whispered in fear, but a real place operating entirely outside the reach of public knowledge, waiting for someone bold or foolish enough to find it. When the journalist finally crossed the threshold into Milbrook, the forest seemed to close behind them, swallowing the path and leaving only the whisper of leaves and a sense of being watched. The town itself was quiet, deceptively so, as if the buildings and streets had absorbed centuries of silence and were exhaling it in measured doses. Families moved about their routines with the rigidity of rehearsed scripts, eyes flicking with suspicion toward the newcomer, mouths shutting tightly when addressed, and a coldness that felt like it had been cultivated over generations. The journalist realized quickly that they were not simply observing a town, but stepping into a living organism shaped entirely around control, fear, and inherited obedience. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction carried weight, a subtle communication of what was permitted and what could trigger punishment. The people were bound to one another not just by blood but by the invisible chains of rules drilled into them before they could even form a memory of freedom. Children grew up learning that questioning elders was a dangerous act, that curiosity was a weakness, and that loyalty to the lineage outweighed loyalty to themselves. The journalist noticed patterns repeated from the physician's journal, the same odd mannerisms, the same rigid social hierarchies, the same fearful vigilance. It was a town that watched itself, policing every action as if the consequences of failure extended far beyond the individual. Outsiders, the town believed, brought contamination, physical, moral, and spiritual, and the presence of the journalist immediately rippled through the community like a dropped stone on still water. Doors were closed a little faster, heads turned a little more sharply, and whispers carried down hallways that seemed impossibly long. Every house felt like a cage, and every resident seemed both prisoner and jailer in a system that had been perfected over generations. As the journalist moved deeper, they realized that Milbrook was not chaotic or disorderly. It was terrifyingly organized, with rituals, hierarchies, and patterns of behavior that were enforced without visible coercion, simply because obedience had become instinct. The line between fear and devotion had blurred, and those living there could no longer imagine life outside the invisible walls the elders had built. The journalist understood that witnessing this was only the first step. Understanding it fully would require peeling back layers of secrecy, tradition, and inherited terror, each one more suffocating than the last, until the true nature of Milbrook revealed itself in all its chilling, methodical design. The moment the journalist stepped into Milbrook, the air itself seemed to shift, heavy with a silence that was unnatural and deliberate. The town did not announce itself with the normal markers of life, children laughing, dogs barking, the low hum of daily routines, but instead moved with a precision that suggested every action was measured, every movement observed, every word weighed. People walked along cracked streets as if performing a ritual, their eyes darting with cautious calculation, glances exchanged that carried meanings invisible to an outsider. It became immediately clear that Milbrook was more than a town, it was a self-contained system, a a society engineered to enforce obedience, fear, and conformity through generations of unbroken ritual. Families operated like machines, roles inherited as certainly as bloodlines, and the journalist could sense that deviation, even the smallest hint of curiosity or resistance, would be noticed and punished. Children moved with a peculiar stillness, learning at an early age that attention from outsiders was dangerous and that the town's unspoken rules governed everything, from when they could speak to whom they could acknowledge, to how they were expected to comport themselves in silence. The journalist began to perceive the subtle ways in which control had been internalized. Doors closed a fraction of a second too quickly, heads turned abruptly, and conversations dropped at the sound of their approach. Trust did not exist in Milbrook except in the forms dictated by the elders, and the town seemed to breathe in unison, every household part of an invisible network of surveillance and compliance. Patterns emerged immediately. People carried the weight of inherited fear, movement choreographed by generations of expectation, behaviors that were repeated not out of personal desire but because obedience had become instinctual. The journalist realized that the outward calm and order were illusions masking a society shaped by isolation, coercion, and deeply ingrained ritual. Every glance and gesture was a test, and the very act of observing felt like entering a game in which the rules were unknowable and failure might be costly. It became apparent that Milbrook's residents were both prisoners and guardians of a system that had been perfected over decades, their identities intertwined with a lineage that defined not just their choices but their very thoughts. The journalist felt the creeping weight of history and expectation pressing down, a realization that understanding Milbrook fully would require confronting not only the physical town but the invisible structures of fear, loyalty, and tradition that had transformed a community into a meticulously controlled organism, one that had learned to perpetuate itself across generations with relentless precision. Beneath the surface of Milbrook's rigid routines and silent streets lurked a force that few outsiders ever glimpsed: the Patriarch Council, an unseen authority that ruled the town with absolute power, shaping lives, marriages, and even deaths according to rules written long before anyone now living had been born. The council was composed of the oldest family heads, men whose faces bore the wear of decades spent overseeing obedience, their voices carrying the weight of law even when unspoken. They decided who could marry whom, ensuring the careful preservation of bloodlines, and dictated the roles each resident would occupy within the town's hierarchy, from labor to education to religious observance. Their influence extended far beyond scheduling or governance. It penetrated the very psychology of the town, instilling a sense of inevitability in the residents, a belief that their choices were not their own but part of a divine plan only the council could interpret. Punishments, too, were meted out according to their secret judgments, often invisible to the rest of the town but understood through subtle social cues: a lowered gaze, a whispered warning, a door left unlocked at night for reasons no one dared question. The council's power was not enforced through overt violence alone. It relied on fear, superstition, and the psychological conditioning that had taken root over generations, teaching each child from birth that obedience was survival and that questioning authority was unthinkable. Stories circulated among the youngest members of the community about consequences so terrible they were never spoken aloud, and the mere possibility of the council's scrutiny kept the town in a state of constant self-regulation. Even the adults who carried authority themselves remained subject to the council's unspoken will, ensuring that the hierarchy perpetuated itself without challenge. Outsiders who stumbled into Milbrook quickly sensed this invisible web of power: the way eyes followed them, the careful adjustments in conversation, the almost imperceptible tension that tightened whenever a stranger approached. It was as if the council's gaze reached beyond the walls of their meeting hall, touching every home, every street, every shadowed corner, ensuring that the town remained exactly as it had been designed. The journalist, observing these dynamics, could see that Milbrook was not chaotic or disorganized. It was terrifyingly ordered, a society molded by decades of calculated authority, the council's control absolute and unquestioned, their influence so deeply ingrained that residents could no longer conceive of a world in which the rules did not apply, a world beyond the council's invisible dominion, a world in which freedom might exist at all. As the journalist delved deeper into Milbrook, it became increasingly clear that the town was not merely aware of their presence, it had been watching long before they arrived. There were small, almost imperceptible signs at first: the subtle shift in posture when someone entered a room, the sudden silence that fell over a conversation, The way children's eyes lingered a second too long, observing, memorizing, judging. Windows that seemed empty contained shadows moving just beyond sight, and doors that were supposed to remain locked appeared to shift slightly, as if acknowledging the intrusion. The realization came slowly, almost like a creeping chill, that the town itself functioned as a network of observation, its people trained over generations to monitor, report, and respond to anomalies with near-perfect coordination. The journalist understood that nothing they did went unnoticed, from the direction of their gaze to the speed of their steps along the streets. Even casual interactions with residents carried weight, each word carefully catalogued, analyzed, and potentially relayed to the unseen Patriarch Council. The feeling of being watched grew suffocating, a constant pressure that turned ordinary moments into exercises in vigilance and self-restraint. Every photograph taken, every note jotted, every question asked risked exposure, and with that exposure came consequences the journalist could only imagine, shaped by decades of precedent and ritualized enforcement. As they moved through homes, schools, and streets, the subtle signals became harder to ignore. A door left slightly ajar as a warning, a figure disappearing from sight the moment it was observed, and an almost imperceptible tightening of expressions around them. It dawned on the journalist that the town had long mastered the art of invisibility while simultaneously exercising total awareness, creating a paradoxical environment where presence and surveillance coexisted in a delicate, terrifying balance. The knowledge of being watched infiltrated the journalist's own behavior, twisting instincts, amplifying hesitation, and forcing them to second-guess every step, every gesture. They began to realize that Milbrook did not just respond to outsiders, it anticipated them, prepared for them, and had been ready for anyone who might pry too deeply into its secrets. This awareness was not overt, it was embedded in the architecture, the routines, and the people themselves, a living, breathing extension of the town's control. The journalist understood that to uncover the truth, they would have to navigate not only the physical town but also this invisible surveillance, this omnipresent gaze that knew more about their intentions than they themselves did, and that at any moment, one misstep could unravel the fragile illusion of safety they carried within them. As the journalist pieced together the fragments of Milbrook's history, patterns emerged that revealed a chilling clarity. This was never an experiment that had gone wrong. Every detail, the generations of inbreeding, the rigid hierarchies, the rituals that veiled cruelty as tradition, the psychological conditioning that instilled obedience and fear had unfolded precisely as it had been intended. What outsiders might see as degeneration or chaos was, from the perspective of those who orchestrated the town, a meticulous success. The bloodlines had been contained, traits amplified or suppressed according to a hidden design, and the community had learned to sustain itself entirely from within, policing its members, perpetuating its rules, and erasing any hint of intrusion or oversight. The journalist recognized that Milbrook's outward calm, its eerie order, and even its silence were all products of intentional construction, a living system that had adapted to isolation, internalized control, and the absence of external accountability. Every deformity, every psychological fracture, every moment of fear that gripped its residents was not failure but proof of the precision with which the town had been engineered, a confirmation that the mechanisms put in place generations ago continued to function flawlessly. The realization was disorienting. What had seemed horrifyingly unnatural was, in fact, the exact outcome envisioned by those who had started it. The journalist also understood that the town's longevity was not accidental. The secrecy, the erasure from maps, and the invisible surveillance network maintained by generations of residents had all contributed to a self-perpetuating structure that could outlast its original creators. Even those who lived there now, born long after the initial plans, were bound to its purpose, both prisoners and enforcers, carrying forward the design as instinct rather than choice. The journalist felt a creeping sense of inevitability, as if stepping inside Milbrook had set them on a trajectory that could not be reversed, that the more they uncovered, the more the town's logic and order exerted control over their perception, their choices, and their understanding of what was possible. The chilling truth emerged that Milbrook was not merely a failed social experiment or a cautionary tale of isolation and obsession, it was a calculated realization of a vision, horrifying in its perfection, terrifying in its completeness. Every element, from the physical layout to the psychological conditioning, had been orchestrated to produce a living, breathing organism, a society that existed entirely on its own terms, beyond judgment, beyond intervention, and beyond the moral frameworks of the outside world. The journalist realized that the deeper they probed, the more they saw the full scope of Milbrook's design, and the more they understood that the town was not a relic of the past but a functioning experiment in human control, one that had succeeded exactly as intended.